I'm 31, and I live just outside of Denver. A few weeks ago, I had to drive home late at night after a grueling business trip. It was around midnight, and I'd been on the road for hours. My eyes were heavy, my body aching from sitting for so long. The highway was almost deserted, with only the occasional car speeding by. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I decided to pull into a rest stop to stretch my legs and wake myself up. The parking lot was eerily quiet. A single streetlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. There were only 2 cars parked there, mine and an old, beat-up minivan sitting at the far end of the lot. It looked abandoned at first, but something about it felt off. I got out of my car, shivering in the cold night air. The silence was heavy, like the world had paused around me. I stretched and yawned, trying to shake off the uneasiness creeping up my spine. That's when I heard it, a faint, muffled sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the nearby trees. But then it grew louder. It sounded like crying. I froze, glancing around the empty lot. The sound was coming from the direction of the minivan. I told myself to ignore it, to get back in my car and drive away. But something about the crying pulled me in. It was soft yet desperate, like a child in distress. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I started walking toward the minivan. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if some invisible force was urging me to turn back. The crying grew clearer, sharper, cutting through the cold night air. When I reached the van, I peered through the back window. My heart sank. There was a child inside, maybe 6 or 7 years old, banging on the glass. His face was streaked with tears, and he looked terrified. I hesitated, my mind racing. Where were his parents? Why was he alone? My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't just leave him there. I reached for the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I opened the door cautiously, leaning in just enough to ask, "Hey, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child didn't answer. He just stared past me, his wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on something behind me. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could turn around, I heard a deep, gravelly voice. "You shouldn't have done that." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing there was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hood pulled over his face. In his hand was a crowbar, its metal glinting under the flickering streetlight. Pure panic set in, and I bolted toward my car. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. As I reached my car, my hands fumbled with the keys. My fingers were trembling so much I almost dropped them. Just as I got the door unlocked and threw myself inside, he slammed the crowbar against my window. The sound was deafening, and for a split second, I thought the glass would shatter. He raised the crowbar again, yelling something I couldn't make out. I scrambled to start the engine, my entire body shaking. The moment the car roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, my headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, the crowbar hanging at his side, watching me disappear into the night. Once I was a safe distance away, I grabbed my phone and called the police, barely able to get the words out. I told them everything. The crying child, the man with the crowbar, the minivan. They assured me they would send someone to check the rest stop immediately. Later that night, an officer called me back. They found the minivan, but it was empty. No sign of the man or the child. The officer then told me something that made my stomach churn. The minivan matched the description of a vehicle connected to multiple disappearances along the highway. Women traveling alone had been lured in by the sound of a crying child, only to be attacked and never seen again. I was the first one who had managed to get away. I couldn't stop thinking about the child. Was he real? Or was he just part of the trap? I'll never know. But that night changed me forever. I still drive that route occasionally, but I refuse to stop, no matter how tired I am. I don't care if I'm running on fumes or about to fall asleep at the wheel. I'll never pull into a rest stop again. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I replay it all in my head. The sound of the crowbar against my window, the man's gravelly voice, the child's terrified face. It's all burned into my memory. And the scariest part, he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. My name's Michael. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. A few months ago, I had to drive out of state for a work conference. It was a 6-hour drive, and since I'd left later than planned, it was already dark when I hit the road. The rain hadn't stopped since noon, making the drive feel even longer. I've always hated driving at night, especially in bad weather. About halfway through my trip, I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering, holding out his thumb. His clothes were soaked through, and he looked miserable. Normally, I would have driven right past him. I've never been the kind of person to pick up hitchhikers. It just feels too risky. But something about him made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening. He was thin, maybe in his late 40s, with a pale face and a defeated expression. The rain was pouring so hard I could barely see him as I slowed down. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. As soon as I rolled down the window, he leaned in and stammered, Thank you so much. My car broke down a few miles back. I just need a ride to the next town. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to drive away, but the desperation in his voice made me feel guilty. I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, dripping water all over the seat. Thank you, he said again, shivering as he buckled his seatbelt. I've been out there for hours. No problem, I replied, forcing a smile. Where are you headed? He mentioned a small town about 20 minutes up the road. As we started driving, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. Something about him didn't sit right. At first, he made small talk, where I was headed, what I did for work, but his answers about himself were vague. He said his car had broken down, but when I asked what kind of car he drove, he paused for a moment too long before answering. A sit-in. He didn't mention a make or model. The conversation died after that. The only sounds were the rain pounding on the roof and the windshield wipers scraping back and forth. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting stiffly on his lap. His wet clothes clung to his body, and his breathing sounded uneven. The uneasy feeling grew stronger. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something was off. About 10 minutes later, we passed a gas station. I'm going to stop here real quick, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He immediately tensed. Why? Just keep driving. The town isn't far. I forced a laugh. I need to fill up, and I could use some coffee. It'll only take a minute. No, he said sharply. I don't want to stop. That's when the alarm bells in my head started screaming. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my heart began to race. I'll just be a second, I said firmly, pulling into the gas station despite his protest. As I parked, he leaned toward me. His voice dropped, and he said, You're making a mistake. I froze. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was a threat or a warning. I'll be right back, I muttered, trying to sound casual. I grabbed my wallet and stepped out of the car, my legs shaking. The gas station clerk, a young guy who looked barely out of high school, greeted me as I walked in. I forced a smile and whispered, I think the guy in my car is dangerous. Can you call the police? The clerk's eyes widened, but he nodded and quickly disappeared into the back room. I pretended to browse the snack aisle, keeping an eye on my car. The man was still sitting there, but now he was watching me. His eyes followed my every move, and I felt trapped under his gaze. A few minutes later, 2 police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. As soon as the man saw them, he threw open the passenger door and bolted into the ring. The officers chased after him, and within minutes, they had him in handcuffs. One of them came over to talk to me while the other searched the man. "Are you okay?" the officer asked. "Yeah," I stammered, still shaking. He said his car broke down, but something about him didn't feel right. The officer nodded grimly. "Good instincts. He's been on our radar for a while. He's wanted for the murder of 2 drivers who picked him up on this highway. You're lucky you stopped here." I felt my stomach drop. The man I'd let into my car, who I'd driven for miles, had killed people in my exact situation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't stopped at the gas station. Now, every time I see someone hitchhiking, I feel a pang of guilt. But I reminded myself of that night. No matter how desperate someone looks, I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 28 years old and live in the suburbs of Chicago. I've always been cautious by nature, never the kind of guy to take unnecessary risks. But that night, my judgment failed me. That night, I learned that some roads are better left unexplored. I was driving home after visiting an old friend I hadn't seen in years. The reunion was nice, but it had run later than I'd planned. By the time I got on the road, it was nearing 1 a.m., and I still had over an hour to go. I was exhausted, just trying to stay awake. The route was mostly rural, with long stretches of dark, empty roads. My GPS chimed, instructing me to take a left turn onto a dirt road. I hesitated. The road looked narrow, surrounded by thick woods, and there weren't any streetlights. I considered ignoring it and sticking to the main highway, but I was too tired to argue with the GPS. I turned, my tires crunching against the gravel. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. My headlights illuminated nothing but trees and dirt. No signs, no landmarks, just isolation. I started to feel uneasy. I'd always heard stories about people going missing on roads like this, but I told myself to stop overthinking. That's when I saw it. A car was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Standing next to it was a man, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. My heart rate spiked. He looked desperate, pacing back and forth. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As I got closer, I noticed the man's clothes were dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. He ran up to my window, yelling something I couldn't hear over the engine. I rolled it down slightly, just enough to catch his words. "Please, my wife's hurt. She's in the car. I need help." His voice cracked, full of panic. Every instinct told me to drive away. Something felt off. But then I thought, what if he's telling the truth? I didn't want to leave someone stranded if they were in real trouble. Reluctantly, I put the car in park and stepped out. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice shaky. "In the back seat," he said, pointing to the car. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the vehicle. The back seat was empty. "Where is she?" I repeated, turning back to him. That's when I noticed his hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with some kind of suppressed energy, like he was holding back from doing something. Before I could process it, I heard movement behind me. A second man emerged from the woods, holding a crowbar. His face was shadowed, but his intent was clear. Adrenaline kicked in. I bolted back to my car, not even thinking, just running. I heard them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. I barely managed to fling the door open and slam it shut before the first man reached me. I locked the doors and floored it. Gravel sprayed from my tires as I sped away, the men shrinking in my rearview mirror. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might explode. After what felt like forever, I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, shaking, and ran inside to tell the clerk what had happened. He listened quietly, his expression darkening as I described the dirt road. "That road doesn't lead anywhere," he said. "It's a dead end." I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't run. Now, I don't trust GPS blindly anymore. Some roads aren't shortcuts. They're traps. I wasn't the type to get sentimental over high school, but flipping through my freshly printed yearbook brought back a weird mix of nostalgia and relief. Graduation was only a few days away, and I was more than ready to move on. I was lying on my bed, absent-mindedly scanning the pages, laughing at dumb inside jokes scribbled by my friends. That's when I noticed something off. There was a picture from the homecoming game, one of those wide shots capturing the student section. Something about the crowd made me squint. There, in the back, barely visible but unmistakable, was a man. He wasn't cheering, wasn't even dressed like a student or a parent. He just stood there, slightly blurred, like he wasn't supposed to be in the shot. I flipped a few more pages. Another candid, this one from a pep rally. My stomach sank. He was there again, standing in the back near the gym doors. Same blank expression, same posture. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a teacher, a staff member. But something about him felt wrong. I turned the pages faster now, scanning random photos. There he was at the senior bonfire. A group of students were laughing, their faces illuminated by the flames, and just outside the firelight's reach, the man stood watching. No one acknowledged him. No one even seemed to notice he was there. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't until I reached the group photos that the unease turned to outright fear. I found the picture of me and my friends, taken on the last day of school. We were all standing in front of the lockers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling. But right behind us, slightly out of focus, was the man. He was standing directly behind me. And this time, he was smiling too. A cold shiver ran through my body. I slammed the yearbook shut. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself it was some weird editing mistake. Maybe someone photoshopped him in as a joke. Maybe it was just some random guy who had been around and no one noticed. I tried to put it out of my head. That night, while packing for college, my phone buzzed with a text. I assumed it was one of my friends making plans for graduation, but when I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. Unknown number. See you at graduation. I just stared at it, my hands suddenly clammy. My brain fought between wanting to dismiss it as a prank and the overwhelming dread creeping up my spine. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I didn't sleep much that night. Every shadow in my room felt too dark, every sound too sharp. I even checked the locks twice before finally forcing myself to lie down. The next day at school, I asked around. No one else seemed to notice the man in the yearbook. Not my friends, not the teachers. Even the yearbook staff had no idea who I was talking about. They pulled up the raw files, and in the original shots, he wasn't there. But in the printed copies, he was. I tried to brush it off, to pretend none of it mattered. Graduation day came, and the whole ceremony felt like a blur. It wasn't until after I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, that I saw him again, standing at the very back of the auditorium. He was grinning. And this time, he raised his hand, just slightly, and waved. I left town the next morning. I don't know who he was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still get messages from an unknown number. I never answer them. I still think about this night sometimes. Even years later, the memory creeps back when I least expect it. I was never the kind of person to believe in the paranormal, but what happened at my college graduation made me question everything. It was a warm evening, and the ceremony was being held outdoors on the university's football field. Rows of white chairs stretched across the grass, each filled with anxious graduates dressed in identical caps and gowns. I was sitting toward the middle, waiting for my name to be called. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. Occasional bursts of laughter, the murmurs of students whispering to each other. The occasional call of a professor reminding us to stay in line. At first, it was just a passing observation, something my brain registered but didn't dwell on. A girl, sitting at the very end of the row. She was wearing a cap and gown like the rest of us, but something about her was off. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost grayish under the stadium lights. And she sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't whisper to anyone, didn't even seem to blink. I kept stealing glances at her, feeling a weird sense of unease. It wasn't just her stillness. It was the way no one else seemed to acknowledge her. The students on either side of her left a noticeable gap, as if they were unconsciously avoiding sitting too close. The name-calling continued. One by one, students walked up, shook hands with the dean, and took their diplomas. Cheers erupted with every name, parents, friends, classmates all clapping, shouting. But she never reacted, never clapped, never turned her head to watch. Then, it happened. The announcer cleared his throat and read a name. Anna Holloway. Silence. No claps, no cheers, not a single sound. I looked around, expecting someone to call out or react, but no one did. The announcer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably at the microphone, as if realizing something was wrong. Then, after an awkward pause, he quickly moved on to the next name, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. But I couldn't let it go. The name felt familiar, and that girl, she still hadn't moved. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The wind had been blowing all night, making our gowns ripple slightly as we sat. But hers didn't move at all. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I barely registered my own name being called, my legs feeling stiff as I walked across the stage. The only thing I could focus on was her. Every time I glanced back, she was still there, still staring forward. After the final name was called and the hats were tossed into the air, I found myself scanning the crowd, searching for her, but she was gone. I hadn't seen her stand. I hadn't seen her leave. She had just vanished. Something about it gnawed at me. Maybe it was my brain trying to rationalize what I saw, or maybe it was pure unease, but I needed to know. After the ceremony, I approached one of the faculty members, an older professor who had been handing out the diplomas. I asked him, as casually as I could, who Anna Holloway was. His reaction was instant. His expression darkened, his mouth opened slightly like he wanted to say something but stopped himself. Then, after a pause, he gave a small shake of his head. She wasn't on the list. I laughed nervously, thinking he misunderstood. No, I heard her name announced. She was sitting at the end of the row. Pale girl, black hair, really quiet. The professor stared at me for a long time. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, Anna Holloway was supposed to graduate 5 years ago. She died in a car accident a week before the ceremony. A cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach. That can't be right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw her. She was there. I swear. He only shook his head. I don't know what you saw, but she wasn't on the list. I left without another word. That night, I searched the university's records, digging through old class rosters. And there it was. Anna Holloway, class of 2018. My hands felt clammy as I clicked on an old article. The headline sent a chill down my spine. Tragic accident claims life of promising student days before graduation. Anna had been driving home late from a study session when her car skidded on black ice and flipped into a ditch. She had died instantly. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. The girl I saw at graduation, her pale skin, her motionless posture, the way no one sat too close to her. It all made sense now. I closed my laptop, trying to push away the growing fear inside me. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe I imagined her. Maybe I was just tired. But then I remembered the silence. Every single student received cheers, claps, whistles. Except for her, somewhere deep down, I knew. I had seen her. She had been there. And no one noticed. Except me. Graduation night had always been billed as a moment of triumph and celebration. A time to mark the end of college life and the beginning of something new. I'd remember the buzz of excitement as I donned my cap and gown, the lingering sense of perfume and sweat in the crowded auditorium, and the applause that reverberated off the walls as names were called. After the ceremony, the building emptied out quickly. Most of my classmates had already gone off to their parties or family gatherings, leaving the auditorium quiet and strangely empty. I was among the last to leave, reluctant to let go of the moment. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I'd left my phone charger behind. I cursed my forgetfulness. My phone was already dangerously close to dying, and I needed it for directions home. With no other option, I decided to return to the auditorium. A building that still held the echoes of the ceremony and the nervous energy of our last moments as students. Entering the auditorium again felt different in the fading light. The main hall, once brimming with life, now lay in near silence, illuminated only by a few dim emergency lights. The janitor, an older man whose tired eyes and slow, deliberate movements told of years spent alone in these halls, was busy sweeping confetti from the stage. His presence was oddly comforting in a place that otherwise felt abandoned. I retraced my steps back to my seat in the second row, where I remembered leaving my charger. With each step, I noticed the eerie hush that contrasted sharply with the celebratory chaos of just hours before. The silence was punctuated only by the soft rustle of my sneakers against the cold floor and the distant hum of the building settling. As I knelt down, reaching for my charger, a strange heaviness in the air made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't match my own movements. I froze. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, echoing across the stage in a slow, measured pace. I glanced up toward the stage and saw a figure standing in the center. Dressed in a cap and gown identical to mine, the person was facing away, standing unnaturally still as if caught in a moment that defied time. At first, I thought it must be another student who'd forgotten something. A friend perhaps lost in thought or caught in the nostalgia of the night. Summoning the courage to speak, I called out, "Hey, did you forget something?" My voice wavered in the silence, uncertain if it would be met with an answer. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The figure remained motionless, and the janitor continued his slow sweep along the stage, seemingly oblivious to the strange occurrence. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, came the words. Did they say my name? I felt my heart sink into my stomach. That voice, it was hauntingly familiar. I remember the news from last summer. A student from our class had died in a tragic accident. Rumors had swirled, and the memory of that friend, whose name was never formally announced during the ceremony, had been seared into my mind. Now, before me, stood someone who should not have been there. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what I was witnessing. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that was unsettlingly blank, a face that seemed to be caught between life and something else. I couldn't tell if the eyes held remorse or if they were simply empty. I asked again, voiced barely above a whisper, Are you? Okay. But the figure did not respond with a reassuring nod or a simple yes. Instead, that chilling whisper repeated, "Did they say my name?" The repetition sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, a plea, and a summons all at once. Paralysis gripped me. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run out of that building as fast as possible. Yet I stood rooted to the spot, transfixed by the unspeakable horror before me. Finally, as if the weight of dread had been too much to bear, I turned and bolted from the auditorium. I barely noticed if the janitor or any other presence was following. My only thought was escape. Outside, the cool night air never felt so welcoming as it did in that frantic moment. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine's hum a small comfort in the midst of my racing heart and frantic thoughts. I left the charger behind on that cold, empty floor, along with something else I wished I could forget. The next day, I returned to the auditorium. Half to recover my charger, half to understand what I'd witnessed. The room was as I had left it, but the charger was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving only the unsettling memory of that encounter behind. To this day, I'm left with a lingering question and an unshakable sense of dread. Was it a trick of the light, my exhausted mind, or something far more sinister? A restless spirit seeking recognition on what was supposed to be a joyous night? I may never know the full truth, and perhaps that is for the best. The memory of that whispered question continues to haunt me, an eerie reminder that some moments should remain unexplained.
Laura had always dreamed of having her own place. She was 26 years old, had a steady job, and after years of living with roommates, she finally found a small but charming apartment that she could afford. It wasn't in the best area of town, but it was cozy, affordable, and most importantly, hers. She moved in on a Saturday and spent the whole day unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the space feel like home. That night, exhausted but satisfied, she fell asleep quickly. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a faint sound. It was soft, almost like the sound of bare feet stepping lightly on the ceiling. She frowned, listening closely. It didn't make sense. She lived on the top floor. There was nothing above her except the attic. She shook off the unease. Old buildings made strange noises, she told herself. Probably just the pipes or something settling. The next night, it happened again. The same soft, deliberate footsteps moving above her. But this time, she also heard something else. A faint whisper. Laura sat up in bed, heart pounding. Was it her imagination? She held her breath, listening. The whispering stopped. For the next few nights, the sound continued, sometimes faint creaks, other times what sounded like something being dragged. By the end of the week, she was sleep-deprived and on edge. One evening, while washing dishes, she caught something in the reflection of her kitchen window. The attic door in the hallway was slightly open. She turned around so fast that she nearly knocked over the dishes. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly approached the attic door. She reached up, gripping the handle, and pulled it open all the way. A musty smell drifted down. Holding her phone's flashlight, she climbed the small ladder and peeked inside. The attic was dark, filled with cobwebs and dust. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then she noticed something in the farthest corner. A stain mattress, a pile of food wrappers, half-empty water bottles, and then, on the wall, a collection of photographs. Her breath caught in her throat. The photos were of her, so were taken from inside the apartment. Shots of her watching TV, cooking, even lying in bed. But the worst ones were taken from above. Pictures of her sleeping. Laura stumbled back, nearly falling down the ladder. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. The police arrived quickly. They searched the attic, but found no one. However, they discovered a small, hidden opening in the attic wall, leading into the crawl space of the building. Whoever had been watching her was gone. Laura packed her things that same night. She never spent another night in that apartment. but sometimes she wonders how many nights had she slept peacefully, unaware that someone was watching her from above. Daniel had always walked home from campus. He liked the quiet, the routine of it. His route took him through dimly lit streets and past empty parking lots, but he never felt unsafe. Until that night. It started with a feeling, a strange, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and noticed a white van driving slowly behind him. At first, he ignored it, probably someone looking for a parking spot. But as he continued walking, so did the van. It wasn't speeding past him, it was matching his pace. He crossed the street. The van did too. His stomach twisted. He kept walking, his mind racing. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe he was overthinking. But then, up ahead, the light turned red at a pedestrian crossing. He stopped, waiting. The van pulled up alongside him and stopped too. He glanced at the tinted windows. He couldn't see inside. The light turned green. He rushed across the street, his pulse quickening. The van didn't move. It just sat there, idling. He forced himself to stay calm. Maybe they weren't following him. Maybe it was all in his head. Just to be safe, he ducked into a 24-hour convenience store and lingered near the back, pretending to browse. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When he finally stepped outside, the van was gone. Daniel let out a breath of relief and started walking again. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from an unknown number. "You're faster than I thought. We'll see each other soon." His breath caught. His fingers trembled as he typed back. "Who is this?" No response. The rest of the walk home, he felt watched. Every shadow, every passing car made his skin crawl. But when he reached his apartment, nothing seemed out of place. He locked the door and forced himself to calm down. Maybe it was just a prank. The next morning, he looked out his window and felt his stomach drop. The white van was parked right outside, just sitting there. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "We'll see each other soon." Daniel called the police, but by the time they arrived, the van was gone. They told him there was nothing they could do. The messages kept coming for weeks. Always the same words. "We'll see each other soon." One night, he woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing again. But this time, it wasn't a message. It was a call, from the same number. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. He didn't answer. The next day, the van was gone. The messages stopped. But Daniel never forgot the fear of knowing that someone, somewhere, had been watching and waiting. Javier had always been a night runner. He loved the quiet of the city after dark, the cool breeze, the feeling of solitude. His usual route took him through a large park near his apartment. A vast, mostly empty space with tall trees, winding paths, and a small playground near the entrance. He had been running there for years, and nothing had ever made him feel uneasy. Until that night. It was a little past 10:30 p.m. when he entered the park. The place was completely deserted, just the way he liked it. His feet pounded against the pavement, the rhythmic sound filling the stillness around him. The only light came from the occasional lampposts, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. As he neared the playground, something made him slow down. The swings were moving, not wildly like the wind had caught them, but gently, as if someone were sitting there, swaying back and forth. And then he saw her, a little girl. She was small, no older than 6 or 7. She wore a white nightgown that looked too thin for the cold night air. Her bare feet dangled just above the ground as she swayed lightly on the swing. Javier stopped. A deep, unsettling feeling settled in his stomach. What was a child doing alone in the park at this hour? He looked around, expecting to see a frantic parent nearby, but there was no one. Just him and the girl. He took a cautious step forward. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. She didn't react. He hesitated, glancing around again. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she had wandered away from home. He took another step forward. "Where are your parents?" he asked. This time, she moved. Slowly, she lifted her head. Javier felt his stomach drop. Her face was too pale. Her eyes, dark and empty, stared straight through him. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It's too late. You shouldn't be here." A cold chill ran down Javier's spine. Something about the way she said it, so flat, so emotionless, made his entire body tense. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she suddenly jumped off the swing and ran straight into the woods. Javier's heart pounded. "Wait," he called out, but she had already disappeared into the trees. He hesitated for only a second before running after her. The woods were dark, almost pitch black beyond the reach of the lampposts. His breathing was heavy, his pulse racing as he pushed past branches and undergrowth. "Little girl," he shouted, "where are you?" No answer. He stopped listening. Silence. Only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Then, somewhere in the distance, a giggle. Soft, childlike, but something about it made his skin crawl. It didn't sound right. It sounded too close. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. But then, a whisper, right behind him. "It's too late." Javier spun around. The girl was standing there, just a few feet away. Her head was tilted slightly, her dark eyes locked onto his. She wasn't breathing hard from running. She wasn't even moving, just standing there, staring. Javier took a step back. Something was wrong. "Who are you?" he managed to ask. The girl's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to answer. Then, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Javier jumped and whipped around, heart nearly leaping out of his chest. It was a park guard. "What the hell are you doing out here?" the man asked, frowning. Javier turned back to point at the girl, but she was gone. The guard followed his gaze, then sighed. "You saw her, didn't you?" Javier stared at him, his mouth dry. "What do you mean?" he asked. The guard gave him a long look before finally speaking. "You're not the first one," he said. "People have been seeing her for years. Same spot, same time of night." Javier felt his stomach twist. "Who is she?" The guard hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "A little girl disappeared in this park a long time ago. They searched for days, but they never found her." A cold, sinking feeling settled in Javier's chest. "And the people who see her?" he asked. "What happens to them?" The guard exhaled. "Some say nothing. Others, well, let's just say not everyone who runs through this park at night makes it back out." Javier felt the weight of those words settle deep in his bones. That was the last time he ever ran at night. And even now, years later, when he passes by that park during the day, he can't help but glance at the swings. Sometimes, when the wind is still, when the air is unnaturally silent, one of them moves, and in the distance, he swears he can hear a giggle. Matteo had been talking to Sophia for weeks. They met on a dating app, and the connection was instant. She was charming, intelligent, and mysterious. Every night, they stayed up late texting, sharing secrets, and laughing about silly things. He felt like he already knew her. So when Sophia suggested an unusual first date, meeting in her country house just outside the city, Matteo hesitated but ultimately agreed. "It's a beautiful place, quiet, no car noise or annoying people," she had told him. Though he found the idea of such an isolated spot a bit strange, his curiosity and excitement won out. The road to her house was long and winding, with thick trees on both sides. His GPS lost signal 10 minutes before he arrived, and his phone showed no service. The deeper he drove, the more uneasy he felt. When he finally reached the house, his stomach twisted. The cabin stood alone in the middle of the dense woods. It looked old and neglected, the wooden door slightly cracked, the windows covered in grime. The trees seemed to press in, swallowing any sign of civilization. Matteo parked his car, hesitating before stepping out. No other cars, no streetlights, just silence. Before he could reconsider, the door creaked open and Sophia appeared. She smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "You made it." Inside, the cabin was unsettling. There was almost no furniture, only a table in the center with 2 chairs. In the dim candlelight, Matteo noticed boxes stacked in the corners. No television, no photos, no personal touches, It's a bit empty, isn't it? He joked nervously. I like minimalism, Sophia said smoothly, closing the door behind him with a click. Dinner was already served, something that looked like stew. The taste was strange, metallic. Then, the dizziness started. His vision blurred. His limbs felt heavy. Sophia watched him, resting her chin on her hands. Are you okay? She asked, her voice calm, her smile never fading. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to move. A cold sweat ran down his back. Sophia leaned in closer, her dark eyes locked onto his. Relax, she whispered. I always love meeting new people and collecting their memories. The room darkened. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was a figure emerging from the shadows. A gaunt, hollow-eyed face. A grin that stretched too wide to be human. The next morning, the cabin was empty. No furniture, no Sophia, and no Matteo. Carla hadn't dated in months. She had been too busy with work, exhausted from past relationships, and, to be honest, a little afraid of putting herself out there again. But Andres seemed different. They met on social media, exchanged messages, and after a few weeks, she finally agreed to meet him in person. They chose a small cafe downtown, cozy, intimate, but public enough to make her feel safe. When she arrived, Andres was already there, waiting at a table by the window. He looked just like his pictures, maybe even better. He stood as she approached, flashing a warm, easy smile. I was worried you wouldn't show up, he admitted. Carla laughed. I almost didn't, but here I am. The conversation flowed naturally. They talked about their favorite movies, childhood memories, and places they wanted to visit. The cafe was dimly lit, the scent of coffee and vanilla filling the air. And for the first time in a long while, Carla felt a spark of excitement. Then, in the middle of her story about a childhood vacation, Andres suddenly straightened up. I'm going to the bathroom. Be right back, he said, flashing her a reassuring smile before disappearing down the hallway. Carla nodded, watching him go. At first, she scrolled through her phone, thinking nothing of it. But after 5 minutes, she glanced toward the bathroom door. Still no sign of him. Another 10 minutes passed. Her stomach tightened. She texted him, everything okay? No response. The cafe wasn't big. She could see the entrance clearly from her table. He hadn't left. After 20 minutes, she finally stood up. Something was wrong. She walked toward the bathroom, her heart pounding harder with each step. She knocked gently. Andres. Silence. Her throat tightened. She pushed the door open. Empty. The bathroom had no other exit. No windows. No doors except the one she had just walked through. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She hurried back to their table, and that's when she noticed something chilling. Andres' jacket was still draped over his chair. His phone was lying face up on the table. If he had left, why would he abandon his things? She picked up his phone with trembling hands. The screen was still on, showing an open messaging app. The last message he sent made her stomach drop. Help me. Don't turn around. The words blurred as panic set in. Then, before she could react, a waitress hesitantly approached her. Are you okay? She asked. Carla turned to her, clutching the phone. I was here with someone. Andres. But he went to the bathroom and never came back. The waitress paled. Did you say short hair? Black shirt. Carla nodded. The waitress took a step back, her voice barely a whisper. That guy. He was here 2 nights ago, with another girl. Carla's breath hitched, and she disappeared too. A creeping dread wrapped around her chest. Her fingers tightened around Andres' phone. Then suddenly, it vibrated in her grip. A new message appeared from an unknown number. You didn't look hard enough. I'm right behind you. A cold breath touched the back of her neck. Carla's body froze. She felt it. The presence. Standing directly behind her. The air around her grew heavy. Her vision blurred at the edges. Slowly, she turned her head. The cafe went dark. And then, silence. Lucas and Valeria met at a party, introduced by mutual friends. Their chemistry was instant. After days of texting and flirting, Lucas finally asked her out. Something simple, he suggested. A movie. Valeria agreed. They picked a late-night showing of a thriller. The perfect mix of casual and suspenseful. When they arrived at the theater, it was almost empty. Only a few people were scattered in the front rows. Lucas found it odd. It was a popular movie. Weird that it's this empty, he murmured. Better for us, Valeria joked, grabbing his hand and leading him to the back row. The lights dimmed. The movie began. Then Lucas noticed him, a man with pale skin and sunken eyes sitting several rows ahead. But he wasn't looking at the screen. He was turned slightly, his head tilted unnaturally, staring at them. Lucas shuddered but tried to ignore it. Maybe the guy was just weird. But every time he glanced back, the man was closer. First, he was 3 rows ahead, then 2, then 1. Lucas's pulse quickened. His hands felt clammy. Valeria, he whispered, "We should go." She turned to see what he meant, but the man was gone. The tension in Lucas's chest didn't ease. Then his phone buzzed. A notification. Don't look back. A breath of icy air brushed against his ear. Valeria gripped his arm. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers were trembling. The temperature in the theater plummeted. The air felt thick, heavy, like they were no longer alone. Lucas's breathing hitched. He knew. Something was behind them. He clenched his jaw, squeezing Valeria's hand. And then, a slow, wet breath exhaled against his neck. His phone vibrated again. Another notification. "Got you." Lucas snapped. He grabbed Valeria's hand and bolted from their seats. They sprinted down the stairs, shoving past the empty rows, bursting through the exit. When they stumbled into the lobby, it was empty. No workers. No other guests. They turned back to the theater entrance. Pitch black. Then, a flicker. The screen inside the theater flickered on again. And there they were, Lucas and Valeria, sitting in the last row, staring blankly at the screen. But they were still here, weren't they? A choked gasp escaped Valeria's lips. Lucas's phone vibrated one last time. A final message. "You never left." Carlos had spent the whole day in the city for work. He was exhausted, and all he wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sleep. The mountain road he always took was solitary and dark, but he knew it well. The car's clock showed 1:37 a.m. when the fog started to thicken. It seemed to move unnaturally, swirling along the road, forming fleeting figures that disappeared into nothingness. That was when he saw her. By the side of the road, briefly illuminated by the headlights, stood a woman in a dirty white dress, motionless. She didn't make any sign, nor did she try to stop him. She was just there, her head slightly tilted. Carlos felt a jolt of discomfort. Something about her didn't feel right. His instinct screamed at him not to look, to just keep driving. But as he passed by her, she slowly turned her head and whispered his name. "Carlos." The sound was sharp, like she was inside the car with him. His heart hammered against his chest. She shouldn't know his name. He gripped the wheel, accelerated, and forced himself not to look in the rearview mirror. But a cold sensation crawled down his spine. Something wasn't right. Fearfully, he shifted his eyes to the rearview mirror. She was there, sitting in the back seat. Carlos felt his blood drain from his face. He couldn't see her face clearly, only a silhouette in a tattered dress. His breathing became erratic. He tried not to lose control of the car. She wasn't there. It had to be his imagination. But then, in the dimness of the mirror, she smiled. Her lips stretched too much, more than a human mouth could. And then, slowly, she tilted her head until her face was completely upside down. "You shouldn't have looked at me." The car's radio exploded in static. Carlos screamed and slammed the brakes. The car skidded and veered off the road. It hit a tree, and Carlos's head slammed against the steering wheel. Everything went dark. When he woke up, the car was wrecked. The fog was thicker, and the road felt endless. There was no trace of the woman, or at least that's what he thought, until he looked in the rearview mirror one last time. There she was, smiling, closer and closer. David had been searching for a cheap car to get around without relying on public transportation. Finally, he found one, an old but functional model, sold by a man in a nearby town. The price was surprisingly low, too low. When he arrived at the address, the seller, an elderly man with a tired face, greeted him with a strange expression. "Don't use it at night," he said, handing him the keys with a trembling hand. "And never open the trunk." David thought the man was just an old fool. He paid, signed the papers, and left. It didn't take long for him to regret it. From the moment he started the engine, something didn't feel right. The car had a musty smell, a mix of dampness and rot. He turned on the radio to distract himself, but there was only static. The road was dark and deserted. David yawned and kept his hands firmly on the wheel. The sound was dull, like someone had knocked inside the trunk. David tensed. The sound repeated louder. He looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing unusual. The knocks grew more persistent, as if something was trapped inside. David swallowed. He wasn't going to stop. But then, something scratched the metal from the inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He adjusted the rearview mirror to see the back of the car more clearly. The reflection showed the empty back seat. But when he looked down at the internal rearview mirror, his blood froze. There was someone there, a dark figure with sallow skin and hollow eyes, staring at him. David whipped his head around. Nothing. He looked back at the rearview mirror. The figure was closer. The knocks on the trunk were frantic. The radio exploded in deafening static, and amidst the noise, a voice whispered, "Let me out, David." David screamed and slammed on the gas. But then, something cold touched his shoulder. The car suddenly turned off in the middle of the road. Breathing heavily, he took out his phone. No signal. The voice returned. "You can't escape from me." His heart pounding, he got out of the car and circled around it. He stood in front of the trunk. He shouldn't open it, but he did. The lid creaked open, and horror struck him head-on. Inside the trunk was a body, his own body, with wide open eyes, frozen in an expression of terror. The mouth twisted in a silent scream. David felt the world crumble around him. Something pushed him from behind. The trunk slammed shut, and on the dark road, the car's lights flickered on, and it began to move on its own. Inside, trapped in the trunk, David pounded and scratched the metal in desperation, just like the last owner before him. Tomas had left his house late for a long trip. He was driving on an empty road when he noticed the gas tank was on reserve. The GPS had no signal. There were no stations marked on the map. But then, a gas station appeared at the side of the road. The fluorescent lights flickered and the old rusty sign read, "Gas station, the last stop." Tomas parked and got out. The place felt wrong. The air was thick, too quiet. Inside the store, there were shelves with expired products and a dusty counter. A thin, hunched old man stared at him from behind the register. "Good evening," Tomas said. The old man tilted his head with a stiff gesture. "You're the first one to pass through here in years." A chill ran down Tomas's spine. Behind the counter, on the wall, there was a list of names written with chalk. And at the end was his name, Tomas Gomez. His mouth went dry. "Ow, it's happened before," whispered the old man. The lights flickered. When they came back on, the old man was much closer. Too close. Tomas stepped back, tripping over a shelf. He looked toward the door. His car was gone. The road had vanished. There was only an immense, dark nothingness. Tomas gasped, ran to the door, and went outside. The cold seeped into his bones. The desert had disappeared. Only the gas station remained, and the old man was already outside, watching him. "Don't worry," he whispered. "Everyone tries to leave." Tomas looked around desperately. On the ground, where his car had been, there was something else. A pile of bones bleached by time. Among them, a rusted phone with still a working battery. A notification on the screen. A message sent 10 years ago. "If you find this, don't enter the gas station. Run. Don't look back. Because if you see the list of names, you can't leave." Tomas shuddered. His eyes returned to the old man. "It's your turn," he said with a rotten smile. The wind howled. The lights of the gas station went out forever. When the road appeared again, Tomas was no longer there. Only his name remained on the wall, waiting for the next one. Clara had always been an ambitious student. From the moment she enrolled in university, she was determined to excel in her field of paranormal studies. It wasn't long before she discovered an old building on campus known for its eerie history, the research building. The building was a maze of dark, narrow hallways and rooms that had been abandoned for decades, except for one particular room, Room 3, which housed the university's most mysterious and dangerous experiments. The room was notorious among students. Rumors of strange occurrences, disappearances, accidents, and strange sounds had plagued the building for years. Some students whispered that the room was cursed, while others claimed it was haunted by a spirit that had once been an experimental subject. But Clara, driven by her curiosity and thirst for knowledge, was not one to believe in superstitions. She saw the room as a challenge, an opportunity to uncover what truly lay hidden. One evening, she stayed late to continue working on a research paper about the history of paranormal phenomena. The library had closed, and she found herself alone in the dimly lit building. As she walked through the long, echoing hallways, she noticed a strange chill in the air, as though the building itself were alive and watching her. It was almost as if the very walls whispered her name. Curiosity led her to Room 3. The door was old and made of weathered wood, but there was something inviting about it, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She hesitated for a moment, but then pushed it open. The room was smaller than she had expected and filled with old, dusty equipment. In the far corner of the room, there was a desk with a single lamp on it, casting an eerie glow across the room. As Clara walked in, the door behind her slammed shut, almost as though it had been pushed by an unseen hand. She immediately felt a cold rush of air sweep through the room, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. At first, she thought it was just the building settling, but then the temperature dropped drastically. It became so cold that she could see her breath, even though it was a warm night outside. Suddenly, Clara heard faint footsteps in the hallway. She turned quickly, but no one was there. The silence that followed was suffocating. She walked toward the door, but when she tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic started to creep in as she desperately tried to force the door open, but remained locked. The lights flickered, and she heard something, or rather someone, whisper her name from the corner of the room. Clara spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, growing longer and darker with every passing second. She stepped back toward the desk and noticed an old photograph lying face down. She turned it over, her heart racing. The photograph was black and white, depicting the very same room, but something was off. In the background, standing next to a shelf, was a shadowy figure, almost transparent like a ghost. The figure was staring directly at the camera, its eyes hollow and empty. Clara's blood ran cold. She quickly tried to leave the room again, but as soon as she touched the door, the lights went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The temperature dropped even further, and Clara felt as though she could hear breathing in the room, slow, heavy, and labored. It wasn't her own. The door opened, but not because she touched it. It opened on its own, slowly, like something was beckoning her to enter. Clara hesitated but stepped forward. The room seemed to stretch before her. She could hear a faint sound now, like a child crying, but when she looked around, there was nothing. The room seemed to grow darker with every step she took. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw it. The shadowy figure from the photograph was standing in the corner of the room. It was no longer a vague shape. It was solid, towering over her. Its eyes locked onto hers, hollow and soulless. "Leave now," the figure whispered, though its voice was more of a growl. Clara turned to flee, but the door slammed shut again with a deafening crash. The figure began to move toward her, its footsteps slow and deliberate. With each step, Clara felt her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. Desperation overcame her. With all her strength, Clara pushed against the door. It budged just enough for her to slip through, and she ran into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. As she fled down the long corridor, she heard the footsteps behind her, always just a step away. When she finally reached the exit, she didn't stop running until she was outside, breathing the fresh air of the night. But that was just the beginning. Clara thought she had escaped, but from that night on, she felt a presence following her, like eyes watching her every move. And every time she closed her eyes, the shadowy figure from the room appeared in her dreams, always saying the same thing: "You can never escape me." At Grimwood University, there was a legend that had been passed down for generations. The students spoke in hushed tones about an underground library hidden beneath the campus, a place that had been sealed off for years. No one knew how to access it, and no one dared to try. According to the stories, the library was not like any other. It was home to books that were cursed and some of the most dangerous knowledge in the world. It was said that long ago, the headmaster of the university, a man named Professor Redmond, had made a pact with dark forces in exchange for forbidden knowledge. He had delved too deep into occult practices, and his greed for power had led to his disappearance. Some said he died in the library. Others said he was trapped there, bound to its shelves for eternity. Javier, a curious and adventurous student, had always been intrigued by the stories. He didn't believe in such things. He considered them to be nothing more than myths meant to scare new students. But there was something about this particular legend that caught his attention. He became obsessed with it. Late at night, he would search the library for any hint of the hidden entrance, any clue that could lead him to the forbidden library below. One rainy evening, when the campus was quiet and empty, Javier finally found it. A hidden door in the basement of the university's oldest building. The door was covered in dust, almost as if it hadn't been opened in centuries. With trembling hands, he turned the old, rusted knob and stepped inside. The air inside was thick and oppressive, like stepping into another world entirely. The underground library was vast, its shelves filled with ancient, tattered books. The dim light from his flashlight cast eerie shadows across the room. The smell of mildew and decay filled his nostrils as he walked deeper into the labyrinth of books. As he explored further, Javier began to feel a sense of unease. It wasn't just the cold. It was as though something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He felt eyes on his back, even though he was alone. He tried to ignore the creeping sensation and continued his search. But as he walked deeper into the library, the air grew colder and the shadows darker. Suddenly, he stumbled upon an old book lying on a pedestal in the center of the room. It was bound in what appeared to be leather, and its pages were yellowed with age. As he opened the book, he saw strange symbols etched into the paper. The words seemed to writhe before his eyes, as though they were alive, moving on the page. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, and Javier heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. His heart began to race. He heard the footsteps again, closer this time. He dropped the book and turned to leave, but the entrance had vanished. The shelves stretched on forever, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The shadows in the library began to move. They twisted and grew, forming shapes that seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of his vision. Javier felt the weight of their gaze on him, and he knew he wasn't alone anymore. It was then that he saw him, the figure in the dark cloak, standing at the far end of the library. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but Javier could feel its presence, cold and malevolent. The figure took a step toward him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You should never have come here," the figure whispered, its voice low and rasping. Javier tried to run, but the library seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in around him. The shadows followed him, reaching out like tendrils, pulling at his legs. He couldn't escape. The figure moved closer, and with each step it took, Javier felt his strength drain from him. The last thing he heard was the figure's voice in his ear, whispering one final warning: "You belong to the library now." Mariana had always been fascinated by the mind. As a psychology student, she spent countless hours studying the workings of the brain, particularly how dreams could influence reality. When she heard about an experimental study on lucid dreaming being conducted at her university, she knew she had to be a part of it. Dr. Sinclair, the professor in charge, was a charismatic but mysterious figure. He promised the participants that they would be able to experience total control over their dreams. The idea of being able to shape her dreams and explore the subconscious intrigued Mariana, so she eagerly signed up for the study. The experiment was conducted in a dark, sterile room filled with monitors and wires. Each participant was hooked up to a machine that would record their brain activity during sleep. The idea was simple. Through a series of carefully controlled techniques, the participants would enter a state of lucid dreaming where they could consciously control the events of their dreams. The first night was uneventful. Mariana found herself in a peaceful meadow with a soft breeze blowing through the tall grass. It felt serene and beautiful, a perfect dream. But when she tried to wake up, something went wrong. She couldn't move. She couldn't wake up. It was as though her body was frozen in place. And no matter how hard she tried to wake herself, she remained trapped in the dream. The dream shifted, becoming darker and more distorted. She was no longer in the meadow, but in a long, dark hallway. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she felt the weight of something terrible watching her from the shadows. She turned to run, but the hallway stretched on forever. As she moved through the endless corridor, Mariana encountered strange figures, faceless, contorted shapes that lurked in the darkness, always just out of sight. They whispered her name, their voices echoing in her mind. Each time she tried to wake up, the dream became more real, more suffocating. On the second night, Mariana tried again, but this time, the dream took a darker turn. She found herself trapped in a room, locked in a cage with no escape. The shadows outside the cage seemed to move and twist, forming shapes that were not quite human. They reached through the bars, trying to pull her closer. Their touch was ice cold, like death itself. Mariana's fear intensified, and she realized that something was horribly wrong with the experiment. The more she tried to escape, the more the dream seemed to feed on her fear, growing stronger and more terrifying. By the third night, Mariana was no longer sure if she was dreaming or awake. She was losing track of reality, unable to distinguish between the dream world and the waking world. She would wake up only to find that the world around her felt distorted, as though it had been shaped by the nightmare she had experienced. The more Mariana delved into the dream, the more she realized that the experiment had gone far beyond what anyone could control. The boundaries between dream and reality had become blurred, and she could feel the shadows closing in on her. There was no escape, and then, one night, she saw it, a dark, hooded figure standing at the foot of her bed. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it reached out for her. She screamed, but no sound came out. As the figure touched her, the world around her shattered, and everything went dark. A few years ago, my cousin and I decided to explore an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. We had heard stories about it, a wealthy family that disappeared without a trace in the 1970s, and the house was left empty. Our curiosity led us to enter one night, flashlights in hand. The house was in ruins. The windows were broken, and the door barely hung on its hinges. Upon entering, the air was thick with moisture and decay. We walked through the main room, where some dusty furniture still remained. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from upstairs, like someone dragging their feet. We thought it was an animal, but the sound was too human. We went upstairs, and upon reaching the hallway, we found several closed doors. We approached one, and when my cousin turned the doorknob, the door opened by itself with an eerie creak. Upon entering, We saw a children's room with an old crib and toys scattered on the floor. But what froze our blood was a weak laugh, like that of a small child, coming from the darkest corner. When we illuminated it with a flashlight, we saw no one. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. We tried to open it, but it was stuck. We knocked desperately, until suddenly, the door opened on its own. Without thinking, we ran out of the house and never returned. A few days later, we researched more about the family. We discovered that their young son had disappeared one night, and the parents, consumed by grief, took their own lives shortly after. No one knew what had happened to the child, but we felt something dark was tied to that house. Months passed, but the image of the house and the strange laughter lingered in my mind. I decided to go back alone, driven by a feeling I couldn't ignore. When I arrived, the house seemed even more desolate, with thick fog enveloping the place. I entered and went upstairs, where, at the end of the hallway, I found a door we hadn't noticed before. When I opened it, the room was empty, but strange symbols were carved into the walls. It was then that the laugh returned, this time closer, more distorted. The air grew heavy, and a pressure in my chest made me fear the worst. When I turned around, I saw a reflection in the broken mirror. The empty eyes of a child stared at me. At that moment, I understood that the child had never left. Something in that house had trapped him. With my heart pounding, I ran out of the room, and when I reached the stairs, I saw a childlike figure at the end of the hallway. It was the same child with empty eyes. I knew something dark dwelled there, waiting, claiming those who dared to enter. I managed to escape the house and never went back. But something continues to haunt me. Every time I close my eyes, the laughter returns to my mind, and that feeling of being watched from the darkness never goes away. It was the summer of 2012 when my friend Alex and I decided to sneak into an abandoned house in our city. We had seen it a million times since we were kids, always there with its dilapidated and desolate appearance. It had been uninhabited for years, and during that time, the people in the neighborhood had started telling strange stories about the place. They said it was haunted, that at night you could hear inexplicable noises, lights would turn on by themselves, and shadows move through the broken windows. Of course, all of that was just a bunch of rumors, things adults said to scare us. We took it as a challenge, something fun to do on a boring night. We prepared for the adventure. A backpack with flashlights, some drinks, and a bit of nervousness, but nothing that would stop us. When we arrived, the house loomed in front of us, imposing in its decay. The windows were broken, the garden was a mess, and the front door hung from a single hinge, as if it were waiting to be opened. At first glance, it seemed like the house was dead, but something in the air gave me a slight chill. Still, we crossed the threshold without thinking too much about it. The air inside was heavy, humid, with a smell of mold and something else, like time had stopped there. We walked through the ground floor without finding anything too interesting. Some walls covered in graffiti, broken furniture, and dust everywhere. It wasn't until we approached a wooden door that we realized something wasn't right. The door at the end of the hallway led to a basement. At that moment, a strange feeling took over me, but Alex, as always, was determined to move forward. "Come on, what could happen?" he said, and I, not wanting to seem like a coward, followed him. We carefully descended the creaky wooden stairs, lighting the place with our flashlights. The basement was spacious, but dark and gloomy. It was filled with old furniture and boxes full of useless things. Nothing particularly frightening at first. We began rummaging through the boxes, curious about forgotten objects and old clothes, when suddenly, a faint whisper cut through the air. We looked at each other, both confused. At first, we thought it was our imagination, the typical sound of a house that had been empty for so long. But the whisper repeated, this time clearer, as if someone was speaking right behind us. We turned quickly, flashlights in hand, but there was nothing. The basement seemed as empty and dead as before. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could say anything, one of the boxes next to us fell to the ground for no apparent reason. The crash was like a scream in the stillness of the basement. At that moment, An intense cold filled the room, as if an icy draft had suddenly come out of nowhere. We stood frozen, looking around, not knowing what to think. It was then that we saw it. A shadow slipped quickly into the corner of the basement, moving with a fluidity that didn't seem human. My heart raced, and without thinking, we both ran toward the stairs. But when we reached the top, the basement door slammed shut, as if someone were standing on the other side blocking it. We pounded on the door desperately, shouting for help, but the door didn't move an inch. Panic began to take over me. We didn't know what was happening, but we felt that something wasn't right. The only thing we could do was pound and scream until, suddenly, the door opened by itself. We rushed out of there, not looking back or stopping until we reached the street. The cold night air had never felt so refreshing. Once outside, we stood in silence, staring at the house from a distance, still trying to understand what we had just experienced. We both knew something else had happened there, something that couldn't be explained. Days later, we found out the truth behind the house. The story we had never wanted to hear. In the basement, years earlier, the bodies of several people who had gone missing in the area in past decades had been found. Apparently, the house had been used by a serial killer, and the basement had been his place of torture. The stories of missing people matched what we had experienced. Something in that basement, something that had been trapped there over time, hadn't let us go. And although the house seemed empty, we felt there was something else watching us, something dark and ancient still dwelling within its walls. We never went near that house again, but every time I walk by, a chill runs through my body, as if the echoes of that night still linger in the air, waiting to be heard again. When I was a teenager, my friends and I used to explore abandoned houses for fun. We were drawn to the secluded places, the old structures filled with history, and the thrill of discovering something hidden or mysterious. One summer night, we decided to venture further out of the city limits and found an old house in the middle of the countryside. It was isolated, surrounded by a small forest, and seemed to have been forgotten by time. The structure was in poor condition, with cracked walls and a roof about to collapse, but that only heightened the excitement. We exchanged nervous smiles and decided to go in. The only accessible entry was a broken window at the back. We climbed onto a nearby structure and, with some effort, squeezed through. The air inside was stale, and the humidity was overwhelming. Every step we took echoed in the silence. The house was filled with old furniture and dusty objects, remnants of what had once been a home. The rooms were empty, but in every corner, there were traces of the past. A fallen lamp, books on broken shelves, a frayed carpet. It seemed as if the inhabitants had suddenly left, never to return. We explored the first floor and then climbed up to the second. The creaking wood beneath our feet was unsettling, but curiosity kept us moving forward. When we entered one of the rooms, something caught our attention, a large full-length mirror. It had an intricately carved wooden frame, something that looked like it belonged to a much earlier era. The most surprising thing, however, was that the glass was remarkably clean, almost as if someone had polished it recently, despite the thick layer of dust covering everything else in the house. One of my friends, Tomas, walked up to the mirror and, with a mocking grin, stood in front of it. "I'm sure something is watching us from the other side," he joked, looking at his reflection. We all laughed, but something changed in the air at that moment. My laughter faded when I saw something that froze my blood. In the reflection, behind us, there was a dark figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and an unnatural smile, staring at us intently. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I screamed and pointed at the mirror. "Look," I managed to say, and when everyone turned to look, the figure was there, clear and distinct. It wasn't our imagination. We all saw it. The figure stood behind us, watching us in silence. In the reflection, its empty eyes gleamed with a sinister intensity, and its smile stretched wider, as if it were enjoying our fear. The figure began to move slowly in the reflection, its movement strange, as if it were walking toward us. We quickly turned around, looking frantically around the room, but there was nothing there. It was empty. There was no one behind us. The air seemed to freeze, and the silence became deafening. We stood still, looking at each other, too terrified to look back at the mirror, but the feeling that something was watching us didn't go away. Tomas was the first to react, pushing us out of the room. "Let's get out of here," he shouted, and without thinking twice, we all ran downstairs, sprinting to the first floor as fast as we could, the fear driving us. When we reached the window we had entered through, we jumped out and didn't stop running until we were far from the house, panting from the effort, but the fear still clung to us. The next day, Tomas, who seemed unable to stop thinking about what had happened, decided to go back to the house to investigate further. He convinced himself that maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was all in our heads, but when he arrived, the house was no longer there. It was simply gone. The land where it stood the night before was empty, just trees and an open field. He searched the area, but the house had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. Since then, none of us spoke of the mirror or what we saw that night. As the years passed, we tried to convince ourselves that it was just a trick of the mind, an illusion caused by tension and fear. But sometimes when I look at myself in a mirror, that feeling returns, as if something is lurking behind me, waiting to appear once more. Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone. Every time I pass by a large mirror, a strange pressure settles in my chest, as if something is trying to push through the glass and get closer to me. It's a terrifying sensation, impossible to ignore. And although I try to convince myself that it's just my mind playing tricks, the image of that figure, with its unnatural smile, remains vivid in my memory. I know that what we saw that night wasn't just a mirage. There was something there, something that was watching us, waiting for the right moment to return. I work as a night nurse in a hospital that has been around since the early 1900s. The place is old, and despite the renovations, you can still feel the history lingering in the air. The walls seem to whisper, and the floors creak even when no one is there. Some of the older staff tell stories of strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, lights flickering for no reason, and whispers in empty hallways. I never paid much attention to them, until that night. I was assigned to the 4th floor, a section mostly reserved for long-term patients and the terminally ill. It was a quiet shift, the kind that makes you feel like time is standing still. The only sounds are the distant beeping of monitors and the occasional groan of an old air vent. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., something strange happened. Room 413's call light flickered on. That was impossible. Room 413 had been empty for weeks. I stared at the glowing red light, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was a malfunction that happens sometimes in old buildings like this. But something about the air changed, suddenly heavier, colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I hesitated, but protocol dictated that I check on every call, no matter the circumstances. As I walked down the hallway toward room 413, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The closer I got, the more I felt something watching me. The door was slightly ajar, though I was sure it had been shut earlier. I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, but the faint green glow of the emergency exit sign cast eerie shadows. The bed was empty, but the sheets were disheveled, as if someone had just been there. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mixed with something else, something metallic like blood. My breath came in shallow gasps as I took a cautious step inside. Then I saw him. A man stood in the far corner of the room. He was gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his bones, almost translucent. His eyes were hollow but locked onto mine with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to turn and run, but I was frozen in place, my body betraying me. He took one slow step forward. The lights flickered violently, casting his figure in and out of existence. My heart pounded against my ribs as the temperature plummeted. My breath turned to mist in front of me. He took another step, and I heard a faint, rasping whisper. It was barely audible, like wind slipping through cracks in a window. "Help me." My throat tightened. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The man reached out a trembling hand, fingers unnaturally long and bony. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and for a brief moment, I felt something pulling at me, as if invisible hand were grasping my arms, my chest, my very soul. That's when I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, gasping for breath. My hand was shaking so violently that I knocked over a stack of charts. The senior nurse on duty, an older woman who had worked at the hospital for decades, looked up at me with concern. "What happened?" she asked, furrowing her brow. I swallowed hard, struggling to form words. "Room 413. I saw someone. A man." Her expression changed instantly. The color drained from her face. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm but trembling. "That room?" she whispered, glancing toward the hallway. "A patient named Mr. Holloway died there years ago, but sometimes he comes back." I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. "He always calls for help." I looked down at my arms and realized something that I hadn't noticed before. Faint, finger-shaped bruises had formed around my wrists. I was a medical intern working late shifts in an old hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation. Whispers among the staff about strange occurrences, eerie shadows in the hallways, and voices where there should be none. I never paid much attention to those stories. Until that night. It was a slow shift, and exhaustion weighed heavy on me. I decided to grab a coffee from the vending machine on the basement floor. Normally, I took the stairs, but fatigue won over, and I opted for the elevator instead. Big mistake. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped in. Just as the door started to close, I heard it. A voice barely above a whisper. "Wait." I turned around quickly. The hallway was empty. A shiver crawled down my spine, but I shook it off. It had to be my imagination. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. I leaned against the wall, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the eerie feeling settling in my chest. Then I noticed something. The display above the doors was blank, except for a single blinking dash. The elevator wasn't stopping at the basement. It kept going and going. The hum of the machinery changed pitch, becoming strained, unnatural. The lights flickered violently, casting shifting shadows against the steel walls. A suffocating pressure built in my chest, a presence, something unseen, something wrong. My breathing quickened. Then, the emergency phone rang. The sharp, shrill sound sent a bolt of fear through me. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the receiver before finally picking it up. Static hissed through the line, then a distorted voice, broken and uneven. "Don't look up." My stomach dropped. My fingers clenched around the receiver, knuckles turning white. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to obey. But the moment the voice faded, I became painfully aware of something else. A sound, a soft, deliberate shifting. Something was above me. My breath hitched. I fought every instinct to glance up, keeping my gaze locked on the doors. My pulse pounded in my ears. The light flickered again, and I caught the briefest glimpse of movement. Something black, something impossibly thin, its limbs contorting in the flickering glow. A faint, rasping breath filled the elevator. The air turned ice cold. My skin prickled as an overwhelming sense of dread wrapped around me like a vice. The elevator jolted violently. The lights surged back to life as the doors slid open, but it wasn't the basement. It wasn't anywhere I recognized. A long, unlit hallway stretched before me, disappearing into darkness. The walls were wrong, old, crumbling, lined with rusted gurneys and stained curtains swaying in an unseen breeze. The air reeked of something putrid, something long forgotten. Then, from the darkness, a sound, slow, shuffling footsteps dragging closer. My survival instincts kicked in. I slammed my fist against the closed door button, pounding it repeatedly. The footsteps quickened. Just before the door shut, I heard it again. A whisper, right in my ear. "Next time, you won't escape." Then silence. The elevator lurched, rocketing upward at a speed that made my stomach twist. My ears popped. Then, with a final jolt, the doors slid open to the main floor. I stumbled out, gasping for air, my body trembling. The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby felt too bright, too real. A security guard sitting nearby looked up at me. He must have seen the sheer terror on my face because he frowned, setting down his newspaper. "You all right?" he asked. I turned, pointing at the elevator, my voice barely steady. Something's wrong with it. The guard's expression darkened. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. That elevator's been out of service for years. I was a janitor at a small hospital, mostly working the night shift. The job was quiet for the most part, and I liked it that way. The stillness of the empty halls, the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights, it had a certain peace to it. That is, until I started noticing something odd. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., I would hear the faint sound of soft crying coming from the pediatric ward. At first, I thought nothing of it. Hospitals can be eerie places, especially at night. Maybe it was a restless child, a patient unable to sleep. But after a few nights, I started paying closer attention. All the rooms in the pediatric ward were empty. Yet, the crying continued. The sound was distant at first, like an echo drifting through the halls. But each night, it seemed to get louder, closer. Finally, curiosity and a growing sense of unease got the best of me. I decided to investigate. I followed the sound to room 203. The door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap, I could see a small figure sitting on one of the beds. A little girl, hunched over, her long hair obscuring her face. Her shoulders shook with each quiet sob. Something about the scene sent a chill through me. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore her. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked softly, stepping inside. The crying stopped. A heavy silence filled the room. My breath hitched as the temperature dropped, an unnatural cold wrapping around me like unseen fingers. Slowly, the girl lifted her head. My stomach lurched. Where her eyes should have been, there was nothing, just hollow, black pits, endless and empty. Her mouth twisted into a grin, stretching impossibly wide, exposing jagged, unnatural teeth. The air grew thick, suffocating. The lights flickered. The walls seemed to close in. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached for the door, but before my fingers could grasp the handle, it slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The force rattled the windows. I yanked at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Then she spoke, a voice small and broken, yet filled with something old, something angry. "Why did you leave me here?" A sob racked through her body, but her face remained twisted in that awful grin. My skin prickled with pure terror. The lights flickered one last time, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. I don't remember what happened next. One moment, I was trapped in that freezing room, suffocating in the presence of something inhuman. The next, I was on the floor of the hallway, gasping for air. My head throbbed and my limbs felt like lead. Security found me minutes later, helping me to my feet. Their faces were pale, their expressions grim. When I tried to explain, they exchanged glances. One of them muttered under his breath, "You saw her, didn't you?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who?" The guard hesitated, then sighed. "That girl. She died in room 203 20 years ago. Her parents left her here and never came back. They say she's still waiting for them, still looking." A heavy silence fell between us. I didn't say another word. I quit the next day. When I was a teenager, my friends and I had a tradition. Every summer, we would go camping in a remote forest. It was a peaceful place, far from the city, and we loved it because it made us feel like we were in the middle of nowhere with no one to bother us. But there was one summer in particular that made us swear never to return to that forest. It all started like any other camping trip. We arrived in the afternoon, set up our tents, and began gathering firewood. As we explored the area, we noticed something strange. The trees had carvings on their bark. They weren't natural marks, but deep scratches, almost like symbols or strange inscriptions. Some looked like faces with expressions of pain or fear. One of my friends, Marcos, laughed and said it was probably just some other camper playing a prank. But I wasn't so sure. Night fell quickly, and after dinner, we sat around the fire to tell scary stories. As the night went on, the forest became eerily silent. There were no crickets, no owls hooting, just the occasional crack of branches in the distance. At first, we didn't think much of it, but then the whispers started. They were faint, barely audible, like someone was speaking between the trees, but we couldn't make out any words. We looked at each other, waiting for someone to admit they were playing a joke, but no one did. Then Marcos, the bravest of the group, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the forest. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, we saw something that froze us in place. A few meters away, standing between the trees, was a tall, thin figure with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. It didn't move, it just watched us. Its silhouette was unnaturally elongated, and though we couldn't make out its face clearly, we knew it was looking directly at us. Marco screamed and immediately turned off the flashlight. We rushed into our tents, trying to convince ourselves that we had imagined it. But then the whispers came back, this time closer. The voice was guttural, low, and seemed to echo inside our heads. The words weren't recognizable, but we could feel that it was trying to tell us something. Marcos, unable to take it anymore, stepped out of the tent with his knife in hand and turned on the flashlight again. The figure was gone, but in its place, something worse had appeared. The trees around our camp had more of those strange carvings, and this time, they were fresh, newly etched, as if someone had made them while we were hiding in our tents. We didn't sleep at all that night. The whispers continued until just before dawn, when suddenly everything went silent. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and ran out of there. When we got back to the city, we checked the photos we had taken during the trip, and among them, we found one that sent chills down our spines. It was a picture of our tent, taken in the middle of the night. But none of us had taken it. And the worst part? In the background, standing among the trees, we could clearly see the silhouette of that tall, thin figure, watching us. We never went back to that forest. A group of university students decided to go camping in a forest famous for its local legends. It was said that a man had disappeared there in the 90s, and since then, his spirit roamed the area, appearing to those who dare to stay in the darkness of the night. The group, consisting of 5 friends, arrived at dusk and set up their tents near a clearing. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, and mist began creeping between the trunks, giving the place a more unsettling feel than they had anticipated. But instead of being scared, they embraced it as part of the adventure. The first night was filled with laughter and ghost stories around the campfire. The atmosphere was light until, in the middle of their conversation, one of them noticed something unsettling. A motionless figure standing among the trees, watching them. At first, they thought it was an oddly shaped shadow cast by the fire, but when one of the guys, Daniel, got up and took a few steps toward the figure, it vanished into the mist without making a sound. The atmosphere grew tense. They tried to joke about it to ease their nerves, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Some went to sleep early, while others stayed awake, keeping an eye on the surroundings, but they saw nothing else. At midnight, Sophia, one of the girls, woke up feeling a cold breath near her face. Her skin prickled instantly. Her heart pounded as she opened her eyes, and in the dim moonlight, she saw a figure kneeling beside her sleeping bag. It had no face. She stifled a scream and squeezed her eyes shut, trembling. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. She immediately woke the others, but when they searched the area, there were no footprints or signs of anyone outside their group. No one went back to sleep that night. They reignited the fire and stayed together until dawn. The skeptics tried to rationalize what had happened, while others were convinced they had witnessed something paranormal. The next day, they tried to convince themselves it had been a dream or a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But when they checked the photos they had taken during the night, their blood ran cold. In every nighttime image in the background, among the trees or standing behind them, the figure was there, always watching. Javier and Sophia had heard about a national park with hidden caves, perfect for exploring. They decided to spend a weekend camping, far from the city, craving adventure and a break from their hectic lives. Little did they know, the weekend would take a terrifying turn. The first day went smoothly. They set up their tent near a small creek, built a campfire, and spent hours hiking through the lush forest, marveling at the untouched beauty of the area. As the sun began to set, they sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows, laughing, and enjoying the calm. But when night fully descended, a sense of unease settled over them. The forest, which had been so alive during the day, now felt like it was holding its breath. The silence was deep, almost unnatural. Then, as they prepared to retire for the night, they noticed something strange. Around their camp, there were large, distorted footprints in the dirt, too large to be from a bear and too strange in shape to be from any animal they knew. The prints were deep, as though whatever had made them weighed more than any creature they could imagine. At first, they thought it was the tracks of a wild animal, but as they followed the trail, it ended abruptly, without a trace, as if the creature had simply disappeared into thin air. Javier felt a chill crawl down his spine. Maybe it's a bear, Sophia suggested, trying to reassure him, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. But Javier wasn't convinced. Bears don't vanish into thin air. He ran a hand through his hair, looking around nervously. He tried to shake off the feeling, blaming the wilderness for making his mind jump to conclusions. But the sense of being watched remained. As they settled into their tent, a heavy, uneasy silence enveloped the camp. That night, everything felt off. Javier woke suddenly, his heart racing. He heard a deep, labored breath just outside their tent. He tensed, his eyes darting to the small opening of the tent. Was it an animal? A bear? But then, the sound came again, closer this time. Inhuman. It was almost like a whisper, a rasping voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, and yet so close. I can see you. The words sent a shock of ice through Javier's veins. His stomach twisted. It was not an animal. It was something worse. Sophia stirred beside him, awake now, her breath shallow. She instinctively covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming, her wide eyes locked onto Javier's. She too had heard the voice. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. The shadow of a figure loomed outside, stretched and twisted against the fabric of the tent. The figure seemed impossibly tall, hunched, its limbs long and unnatural. It was like a dark silhouette of a man, but there was something terribly wrong about it. Its arms hung far too low, the fingers too long. Its legs were unnaturally thin, bent at odd angles like it didn't belong in this world. Javier froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature outside seemed to be sniffing the air, as if hunting for their scent. Every fiber of his being screamed for them to run, but he was paralyzed, unable to move. Sophia squeezed his hand, her grip tight, as if to anchor herself to the reality of the moment. They didn't know how long they lay there in the dark, not daring to move, hoping the creature would leave. But as the first rays of dawn touched the sky, the figure disappeared, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was suffocating, and they didn't speak as the sun slowly rose. The creature was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. Without a word, they packed up their things in a hurry, their hearts still pounding. They were about to leave the campsite when Sophia noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A narrow path that led deeper into the woods, a path they hadn't seen before. Javier reluctantly agreed to explore, convinced they had to get out of there. But as they walked, the dense forest around them grew eerily quiet, as though it was closing in on them. The path narrowed, leading them to the entrance of a hidden cave, something they hadn't expected to find on their route out. They entered cautiously, feeling a strange pull, as if the cave was calling them. Inside, the cave was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. At the far end, an altar made of animal bones, tattered clothes, and strange symbols carved into the stone sent a chill through their bodies. Among the rags, they found a backpack, old and weathered. Sophia opened it, and inside was a tattered ID card. It belonged to a young man who had gone missing 5 years ago. They recognized the name instantly from local news reports. He had disappeared while hiking in this very park. The discovery sent a shockwave of terror through them. The cave, the altar, the bones, they all pointed to something far more sinister than they could have imagined. Javier grabbed Sophia's arm. "We need to leave now." They turned to go, but as they retraced their steps through the cave, something caught their attention. Faint, barefoot prints, fresh, as if someone had passed through only hours before. The prints led deeper into the cave, past the altar into the pitch-black darkness. They stared at them for a moment, their bodies frozen in terror. Without another word, they ran. The cave seemed to close in behind them, as if the very walls were pushing them out. When they reached the entrance, they didn't stop to look back. They didn't stop until they were far, far away from the park. When they reached the ranger station, they told their story. The rangers listened carefully, then went to investigate the cave. But when they returned, they reported nothing unusual. They had found the same tracks, barefoot and leading into the deeper recesses of the cave. But the tracks had vanished just as suddenly as the creatures. The rangers believed the prints were old, but Javier and Sophia knew the truth. The creature, whatever it was, had been watching them. It had followed them, and it was still out there in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into the unknown.